Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jim Roddey, and welcome to the Best of Allegheny County radio show. Each week, we plan to bring interesting guests that have a connection to Allegheny County and to you, the listeners. This show is being brought to you by St. Barnabas. Since 1900, St. Barnabas has been caring for people in the northern regions of Pittsburgh, and today St. Barnabas is located in Allegheny, Beaver, and Butler counties. We have 3 retirement living complexes, 5 living assistant residences, a skilled care facility, medical center, memory care, home care, and so much more. We also operate Conley Resort and Golf Club and Suncrest Golf and Grill. All of the retirement living residents at St. Barnabas can golf as much as they want at our 2 18-hole golf courses. So if you're thinking of retiring and love to golf, see St. Barnabas. That's for you. We have a very special show today. As many of you know, the movie about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers as we all know him, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, was recently released in theaters. Here to discuss the connection to Fred Rogers are 2 very special guests. One, a person that was with Fred a lot, David Newell. You might know him as Mr. McFeely, Speedy Delivery. And Max King, author of a new book, The Good Neighbor, the life and work of Fred Rogers, and someone that really was a great admirer of Fred. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Speedy Delivery.
Speedy Delivery. And Max, it's good to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
First of all, let me give you my one thing that I always remember about Fred, and tell me that you both agree with this. Fred Rogers was a television personality, and I watched him on TV because my kids, that was one of 2 shows we let them watch, and so I watched the show. But when I met Fred in person and got to know him and spent some time with him, he was exactly the same off the air as he was on the air. What you saw on TV was the real Fred Rogers. And he never changed that persona.
And he never wanted to be referred to as a performer because he didn't think of himself as a performer or a television star. He thought of himself as a teacher, don't you think,
That's right.
David?
And teacher and a communicator. And people ask his wife, Joanne, is Fred like this at home, or does he throw a shoe across the room or something? And she always responds, what you see is what you get. And you're right.
That was the thing that and every time that I took him to be at an event, or we were together at an event, he would be that way. I took my 2 grandsons. Once we were driving down 5th Avenue, and they had grown up watching the show. And I said, would you like to meet Mr. Rogers? And they laughed. They said, oh, you're always kidding, Grandpa. And I said, no, we'll stop in and see him. And we pulled into QED and went to his office, and they were just stunned. And he took them on the set, and they got to play with the puppets, and he was just so genuine with them. It was like they were doing a show.
Well, he liked nothing better than an opportunity to be with children and to be good to children.
Yeah, but my stock as a grandfather went up about 200%.
I'll bet.
When they found out that I had introduced him to Willie Stargell, I took him to a baseball game at the Pirates. That was okay, but Mr. Rogers, that was the ultimate.
That did it for you.
And they still, I mean, they are, one of them is a captain in the Marines in Afghanistan, the other is a college professor. They still talk about meeting Mr. Rogers.
I hope they've seen the movie.
I'm sure they have by now. David, tell us about your experiences with Fred.
Oh, well, I started 50 years ago. I thought I had a job for 1 year. And you probably know Bob McCulley.
Sure.
I was in London visiting my cousin in 1967. And I got a telegram from Bob McCulley, who knew Fred, said the program's going to go national. And I've given Fred Rogers your name to be interviewed be on the staff. And I said, fine. I came back to Pittsburgh. To make a long story short, I met with Fred, and he talked with me for an hour. But he didn't ask me a thing about my job qualifications, what I could do, and so forth. He talked about me, wanted to know more about me and me and me. And at the end of an hour, he said, when can you start? And I said, next week, Fred, and here I am.
Well, now, how did the character, who came up with the character of Speedy Delivery?
Well, during that interview, he said, oh, by the way, before you leave, I am writing in a character of a Speedy Delivery man, and I want you to play it. I said, oh, that'd be great. My other job was to take care of the props and so forth. And he said, and I want Mr. McFeely to be in a hurry all the time, and I'll use it as lessons, and it'll be opposite of my personality. And he used it as a lesson. But right before we were in a tape, the very 10 minutes before taping, the phone rang, and it was Sears Roebuck's Foundation calling to wish us well and say good luck on your first day of taping. But please don't call the delivery man Mr. McCurdy. That was my name originally because it was the name of the foundation's president. And Fred came out, I could tell something. He said, we've got to get you another name. Before he finished his sentence, he said, McFeely, you're now Mr. McFeely. And we started the...
Well, now, where did that name come from?
That's his
middle
name.
name.
Fred McFeely Rogers.
McFeely
And his
Rogers.
grandfather.
And
Okay.
his grandfather's name was Brooks McFeely. His mother's is his
And
mother's
he
father.
adored his grandfather, and his grandfather was wonderful to him.
His yes, you're right. His grandfather, in a way, raised Fred.
Yeah.
In a way, his parents were wonderful people, but his grandfather spent a lot of time. I think he was the only grandchild at the time. I'm not quite sure.
Well, they were fairly affluent.
Oh, yeah.
And Fred grew up in a home that he had everything, and I don't. But that wasn't his personality.
No.
Well, he was very shy as a little boy, introverted, insecure. He was lonely. He was alone a lot of the time. And as David said, his parents were wonderful and so good. His mother in particular was just wonderfully caring, loving, responsive to Fred. But he did have a struggle as a very little boy. And his parents were, if not the wealthiest people in Latrobe, very close to it. They were probably the wealthiest people out there. And they took great care of Fred. They loved him, but they overprotected him. I'll give you one example. They had a chauffeur-driven limousine take him to elementary school.
Yeah, that goes over good
the
with
town
the
I
kids.
grew up in, you probably get beaten up if you came in.
Well, he almost did.
Oh, I know. Fred told a great, unbelievable story about kids chasing him down the street and yelling, "We're going to get you, Fat Freddy." And what a traumatic experience this was for Fred, and how he processed it. It was a critical point in his growing up from this little boy to becoming a much more very focused and intentional human being.
So he was really a victim of bullying.
Oh, he was.
He was.
He was.
Not physical as much as, but more name-calling bullying. But it's still bullying and still hurt him. And I've often wondered that if he hadn't been called Fat Freddy and dealt with that all of his childhood, if Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood would have ever happened. Yeah. I think a lot of that bullying, a lot of that feeling lonely and gave him empathy.
It focused him on childhood and the problems of childhood, yes. And it stuck with him. And that's what he cared about for most of the rest of his life.
When you tell me these stories, I think back of how he talked to the children on the air, and he really was talking to children that he thought were like he was at that time, and telling them, it's okay, you'll be fine.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
An interviewer once asked him what qualified him to be Mr. Rogers, and he answered, being a child. That's what qualified him. He did not forget his childhood, and that all went into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah,
but in fact, he had spectacular qualifications, yes. Because he got training at NBC in New York in the 1950s, when NBC was just this extraordinary, high-minded was run by a guy named Pat Weaver, who is famous today as the father of Sigourney Weaver. But then he was the president of NBC. And he saw television as culturally uplifting and educational. And Fred learned television there. And then he learned child development at Pitt under Dr. Margaret McFarland, when Barry Brazelton was there, Benjamin Spock was there, Eric Erickson was there. So he was really well prepared to put out a great program.
And then he went to, well, concurrent with that, he went to study theology. He had a...
Right, he was an ordained minister.
Yes, he never had a church, but the church was, if you call it that, he had the biggest congregation in the world. But
because,
yes, I think his childhood prepared him, but you're right, and he was always learning. And even visiting with your grandchildren, every chance he had to be with children, he would learn something, how children would react. He was getting something from that, too. Not only enjoying it, but getting something from those children in front of him.
Wow. Well, we're going to take a short break in just a moment, and we'll come back, and I want to talk about the movie. I want to talk about your book and what caused Max King to decide to write a book about Fred Rogers. And David, I want to hear some stories about episodes and things that happen that people don't know about, that you can tell the background of, because you were on that show for just about every show. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the best of Allegheny County. We're talking to David Newell, Speedy Delivery, and Max King, and author of a book about the good neighbor. We'll be back in just a moment.
Honey, I'm so excited. I found the perfect solution for us and your parents.
Really?
It's St. Barnabas. For us, they have the Woodlands, a beautiful carriage home community.
Very interesting.
And for your parents, there's the Village. It has an indoor mall with shops, a place to do their banking, and great restaurants.
Plus, we can relax knowing they're safe and secure.
St. Barnabas has everything we're looking for.
Great. Let's schedule a tour.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jim Roddey for St. Barnabas, and we are the best of Allegheny County. And today we're talking about Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, the good neighbor that we all loved and knew as children and admired as adults. We have David Newell, who played the part of Mr. McFeely, his Speedy Delivery, on his show, I guess probably just about every episode that he did. And Max King, who is a journalist, was the editor of the Inquirer, Philadelphia, came to Pittsburgh as president of the Heinz Endowment, spent a number of years here, fell in love with Pittsburgh, came back as president of the Pittsburgh Foundation, and spent 5 years there, and was retired recently, and wrote a book about Mr. Rogers, and we're talking to both of them about their experiences. Max, where did you get the idea to write the book, and what was your inspiration? And writing a book's tough, and you have to be really inspired to do it.
Jim, I didn't have any idea how tough it was going to be when I agreed to do it. But what happened was I had retired from the Heinz Endowments, and I went out to St. Vincent to help them get the Fred Rogers Center on Early Learning and Children's Media up and running, start some programs, raise
because
some money.
you had funded that as
that's right,
as a foundation.
That's right. And I said to the chancellor of the college, Archabbot Douglas Nowicki, and to Joanne Rogers, Fred's widow, why isn't there a biography of Fred? He's this iconic American figure. I can't believe. And they both said many people have asked him to let them do a biography, and he wouldn't when he was alive because he was modest. And so we have continued to say no. And I said, well, with all due respect, Fred's gone now, and we have to think about this. If you want me to raise $3 or $4 million to boost the center, we need a biography. And finally, Joanne said, okay, you're right. Why don't you write it? And not appreciating what I was getting into, I said yes. It took
Right
me,
away, you said, yes, I'll do it.
took me 7 years, but I'm so glad to have done it.
I didn't realize it took 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was at the Pittsburgh Golf Club when you and Joanne talked about the book, and that was right when it was first finished.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
That was a great night, and Joanne, I want to talk about Joanne some too, because she was a very important part of Mr. Rogers and who he was and what he did. But it took 7 years to write the book.
Well, I had a first draft done in 4 years, but my agent and my editor wanted it restructured, and that was right when I went back to work at the Pittsburgh Foundation. So it took me longer to get that done. I could have done that in 8 months if I wasn't working, but it took me a little bit longer. But the timing turned out to be perfect because it came out last year, 2018, which was the perfect time for it to come out. And the paperback just came out at the same time the Hanks movie did.
Wow.
So the timing was just fine.
Great. Well, I want to talk about the movie in a
Yeah.
few minutes. But David, tell us, you were on how many episodes? Do you have a number?
We did over 1,000, and I was in over 600.
Wow.
So about 3/4 of them, I would think, or maybe more. That's a guesstimation.
Well,
I was in a lot.
You must have some stories about things that happened on the set, or things that you did wrong, or you ad-libbed or something.
Well, there was one. Fred had a great sense of humor, and one day this is in the documentary. One day the crew decided, I changed the sneakers and shoes. One day, they didn't tell him, they put a different pair of shoes, loafers, for him to change into at the end of the show. Smaller. And you can look at them and you can't tell if it's size 8 or size 10. Fred wore size 10.5. So he was finishing up, putting everything on, and putting his foot into the shoe, and he couldn't get it in. And he was struggling. And then you could hear the crew starting to laugh, and that's an outtake. But they would play tricks on him every so often. But the one thing that shows a little bit about Fred is that I'm a big fan of historical movie theaters, and I belong to an organization called the Theater Historical Society, which promotes not tearing down those old theaters, but repurposing. At any rate, Fred knew that. One day I came into my office, and on my desk was a brick. And I said, well, who brought this brick in? And just then, Fred peeked around the corner, and there he was, chuckling to himself. He had brought it in. He walked by the old Sheridan Square Theater in East Liberty that they were tearing down.
He brought you a brick.
And he brought me a brick. And I use it as a doorstop. And that was Fred. He would think about people. Walking by an old theater, he thought of me.
Wow.
He was always thinking of other people. And weeks after he died, people started getting presents from him in the mail, because he had just, in his last few weeks of his life, he had been communicating with the guy who runs the McFeely Rogers Foundation in Latrobe about what things from his life he wanted to go to friends and associates. And after he died, those things were sent out. So people kind of got a last gift from Fred. He was always thinking about other people.
I got one from Joanne Rogers, brought it in a little shopping bag, and it was a spoon from Stouffer's Restaurant, where we had lunch all the time between the shows.
Right.
And it was made into a napkin ring.
Wow.
And it had a little note on it from Fred. And, it was he would think of right down to that. It was so perfect.
Gee, David, I should have had that for the book. Fred Rogers stole a spoon from Stouffer's Restaurant.
It was probably silver back in those days.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. And every once in a while, that will happen to me. I'll see something and think of someone that relates to this thing, and I'll get it for them. But he did that constantly.
All the time.
Wow.
And he never forgot people's birthdays or anniversaries, especially people who worked at the office. There was a knock on my birthday was on Thanksgiving one year, knock on our door at home, and there was Fred standing with a newspaper wrapped in a necktie wrapped in the newspaper. He stopped by for about 10 minutes, dropped off the necktie. I opened it up. The necktie had a little trolley embroidered in it.
Wow.
And I still have it. It's blue tie with just a little trolley. And he had somebody do it. I don't know. But he thought through all of this. It wasn't just the spur of the moment. That was Fred.
And while this is a really busy person.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote 1,000 scripts. He wrote 200 songs. He wrote 13 operas. He was the producer and the creator of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He did the puppets. He played the piano. He was the host.
He
sang.
He wrote the songs.
He did
Yes, he used to
everything.
sing.
He did everything, and yet he always had time to be thoughtful about other people. It's really remarkable. It's one of the most powerfully attractive things that I can imagine about another person.
Well, now you spent a lot of time with Joanne since Fred passed away.
A lot of interviews.
And
Yeah.
a lot of interviews. And tell us about her.
Oh, she's just a fabulous person. She's as wonderful as Fred, in my view. She's thoughtful and very, very considerate.
And a great sense of humor.
Oh my God, she's got a terrific.
She loves to laugh.
And sometimes ribald sense of humor.
Oh.
Yeah, and
Not just sometimes.
and she's just a delightful person to be with. And I think she's so happy about this resurgence of interest in Fred, particularly because of what she sees as a growing understanding of his legacy, what he stood for, and how important it is.
Well, now, tell us about the movie. David, what's your take on the movie?
I like the movie. The documentary and the movie, you can't compare them. The documentary does tell you more about Fred the person. But the movie, Tom Hanks does an excellent job. And he's up, by the way, he's been nominated for supporting actor for the SAG Awards. They're about, and Golden Globes, I think. They're starting that. But the movie, he's a support in the movie. Fred's character is more of a support. It's a story of the interviewer, really. But you do find out in the movie how Fred listened. He spent a lot of time listening and finding out about people, and that does come through in the movie, which I like. But it's an excellent movie. It's not for children. It's an adult drama, really. And people, I think teenagers would like it, but some people bring 3 and 4-year-olds, and they're not going to like it. And it's not a bio.
Because it's not the Fred Rogers show.
It's not the Fred Rogers story, but it is in a way. It's the Fred Rogers. It gives you who Fred, as a listener. He was such a listener, and that it does. So
Now,
I recommend it highly. I recommend both movies on
I
two
just got
different
an
levels.
email from a friend of mine that wants us to go and see the movie. Tell me about your reaction to the movie, because having spent 7 years writing and you had to.
I think you'll enjoy the movie when you go quite a bit. It's a good movie. It's a very good story. As David says, Tom Hanks is quite good as Rogers, and Matthew Rhys is excellent as Tom Janot, the writer. But it's probably a little bit more about the writer than it is about Fred Rogers. And it shows a side of Fred Rogers that was very important and a great skill. But what I loved about the documentary was it shows you the full range of the man in all his complexity. So I think they're both worth seeing, don't you?
Oh, very much so, yes. But Joanne Rogers and I have a cameo in it, too. You have to watch it. It takes place in a restaurant. So anybody who'll go see it, watch for the restaurant scene.
Well, we have 1 minute left, and I'd like to just tell you a story once that I was talking to Fred, and you mentioned listening and how he was a great listener. And he told me, he said, what was your major in college? And I said, communications. And he said, that's wonderful. He said, communications is 50% delivering the message and 50% receiving the message. And so you better be a really good listener.
That's good.
And he practiced what he preached.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's wonderful. Well, listen, both of you, thank you so much for being with us today. I urge everyone to see the documentary, to see the movie, and to continue.
Buy Max's book.
Buy Max's book, The Good Neighbor. It's a wonderful book, and it tells a lot about the life from his childhood all the way to his stardom. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the best of Allegheny County, and it couldn't be any better than the best. That we talked about Fred Rogers. Thank you both, gentlemen, for being
Thank
with
you.
us.
Thanks for having us.
We'll hope you'll listen to our next episode. We thank our listeners for joining us, and please tune in on Saturday mornings at 9:30 or Sundays at noon for the best of Allegheny County, presented by St. Barnabas, apart from the ordinary. Learn more about St. Barnabas by calling 724-443-0700.
I see you have your checklist out again.
This checklist is for Mom. I found the perfect place. She'll love it. The Village at St. Barnabas. There's lots of activities. A hair salon, restaurants, a place to do her banking.
And just think, no more utilities, homeowners insurance.
And with the shuttle, Mom won't need a car.
So she'll save on insurance, gas, repairs.
You're so practical.
Your mom is going to love the Village at St. Barnabas.
I'll set up a tour.